In this guide, we'll be going over 6 tips that can really improve your general performance as a tank in Final Fantasy XIV. Naturally, these tips will be generally helpful for all tanks and so may include job-specific examples but will be applicable to all or most tanks. Let's start with the first tip, about pulling in a dungeon. This will be done in 3 parts: before the pull, during the pull and finishing the pull, which does not include killing the enemies yet. First, before you pull, check to make sure your tank stance is active. This may only be necessary at the start of a dungeon or raid, as it can be switched off for a few different reasons. It is crucially important that you have your tank stance turned on when tanking. Paladins use Iron Will, Warriors use Defiance, Dark Knights use Grit, and Gunbreakers use Royal Guard. You can either look for the buff in your buff list, or make sure that the button for the tank stance is decidedly a deep blue. Next, regarding sprint. This action obviously boosts your movement speed for 10 seconds, but if you use it before entering combat, it lasts 20 seconds. Clever use of sprint can give you a lot more sprinting time, and in certain dungeons, even using sprint unintuitively early can be helpful to make sure sprint is ready in time for the next pull. Now that we are actually sprinting towards the enemies, the pull is decidedly started, but how do you go about doing that? There are 2 common ways that I recommend, which you can definitely mix together in multiple ways. Option 1. The ranged attack with a provoke weave. As soon as you are in range, you use your tank of choice's ranged pulling attack and immediately find another target to use provoke, the universal taunting action, on. This gives you time to find a third target to use the ranged attack on again. With 4 targets, this strategy still works by either using an ability attack on the 4th enemy and then a ranged attack, or simply using your next GCD on a ranged attack for them too. I recommend this strategy for up to 4 targets, and it is particularly helpful for pulls with a lot of running between packs, as the massive enmity these attacks apply makes the enemies stick to you for a lot longer. Option 2. Run up to the pack. They will typically turn their attention to you and run toward you. Just keep in mind that you don't have long before they start spreading to your group. When you are in range to hit them with an area of effect attack, or AoE for short, go for it, but wait just a moment longer than what seems reasonable, as due to how the game is designed, your AoE attack area is placed just slightly behind you, rather than perfectly on top of you. Make sure to hit everyone as quickly as you can. If you just miss one, you can use provoke to pick it up. This strategy is more effective for 5 or more targets, but I recommend sticking to the enemies just long enough to do a second AoE attack before running on, as otherwise your enmity amounts are quite flimsy and may easily be bested by an aggressive DPS. And finally, how much to pull and when and how to finish pulling. A common question is how many packs to pull. In higher level dungeons, you will often be prevented from pulling more than a certain amount due to walls only disappearing after beating the currently available packs. 2 common pulling strategies include: 1. Pull everything until you are stopped by a wall. 2. Simply pull 2 to 3 packs at a time. These 2 strategies are the common expectation in a dungeon, but if you don't feel confident in your ability or are there for the first time, it is always okay to just pull 1 pack at a time. Just keep in mind that sometimes patrols or other mechanics may make pulling multiple packs at once the easier way. Take note that in lower level dungeons, the walls are often not there and the enemies can sometimes be deceivingly difficult. So just because you can pull everything doesn't necessarily mean that you should. Make sure to weigh the strength of your party before pulling excessively. By extension of that, how does pulling multiple packs work? Circling back to the initial pull, you may realize that the 2 options presented both make it sound like the act of pulling is a rather stressful act, with very little time. This is for a couple of reasons, the obvious one being that the enemies will go all over the place if you don't act fast. The other reason is related to your party. They can't possibly know if you intend to keep going or if the pull is done without watching you. As such, if you stay at the same pack for too long, you may notice the healer putting down a stationary healing field, the ninja may summon a damaging circle on the ground, and so on. For these reasons, you want to pick up the enemies quickly, decide whether you want to grab more, and immediately go for it, and repeat the same process of pulling on each pack to make it as smooth and quick as you can. Again, it is very important you understand that pulling many packs at once is not a requirement to tanking. You will learn to do this with practice. The second tip is about positioning while tanking. Tanks take the same damage from all sides, meaning you don't have to worry about enemies attacking your front specifically. What is important, however, is that a large amount of jobs in Final Fantasy XIV do frontal cone attacks, or attacks centered on an enemy. So if the enemies are spread all around you in a circle, your party may find it difficult to attack all the enemies at once. As such, your first order of business as soon as you finish pulling is to move in such a way that the enemies bunch up. Sometimes the enemies will shuffle away from each other as the fight progresses. You can combat this by lightly moving to the sides and backwards, or even circle around the enemies like a sheepdog. Ultimately, the enemies will move the shortest distance to hit you and will bunch up to do that. Take note that if there are very few enemies, or if you are in a low-level dungeon, some melee DPS may opt to use single-target attacks which may include positional requirements. So they will appreciate you not moving around too much, as this means the enemies don't spin around too much either. An extension of the concept of positioning for bosses specifically. Often, boss enemies will have abilities that swipe in an area in front or behind them. The more common one is in front of them, and for this reason the common procedure is for the tank to run through the boss so it turns around and faces away from your party. This also makes it safer for melee jobs as they will not be too far away from the healer. Additionally, you want to move as little as possible as a tank to make sure your party can reliably predict which way the boss will be facing. If you need to move for a mechanic, that's fine, but generally try to keep the boss standing as still as possible. If a boss mechanic is happening at your location, dodge out of the mechanic and then move back as quickly as possible. Sometimes this means the boss won't even turn at all. I have a short on the subject of dodging telegraphed attacks for some more detailed information. Keeping the boss as still as possible is both important for the party to safely dodge attacks, but also because all melee DPS jobs have positional attacks, so being unable to hit these reliably can cost a lot of damage over time. The third tip is on the subject of defensive cooldown cycling. In Final Fantasy XIV, defensive cooldowns stack multiplicatively. What this means is if you use a 20% damage reduction effect and a 30% damage reduction effect at the same time, they will not result in a 50% damage reduction effect. Instead, you first take the effect of one and then the effect of the other on the remaining damage. For example, subtract 20% off 100%, you get 80%. Then you subtract 30% off the 80%. 30% off 80% is 24%. As such, your end result is taking 44% less damage rather than 50%. Because of this interaction, tanks commonly spread their defensive cooldowns over a large time frame rather than using them all at once. Another reason for this is that healers have a lot of healing options, and many of them don't really cost them anything to use. As such, if you prevent a huge amount of damage for a little bit and then take the full damage afterwards, then the healers will spend the first amount of time doing very little and then afterwards feel overwhelmed. As such, it is better to think of tanking as smoothing the damage intake rather than preventing damage. Simply taking predictable and reasonable amounts of damage is much more valuable to your healer than you blocking more damage. Outside of special cases where you need multiple cooldowns to survive a massive hit, you should stick to a cooldown order, keeping just one up at a time. A common order of priority is to use your short cooldown, if you have it, followed by your 30% damage reduction cooldown. After that, reprisal is an option that reduces the damage done by enemies rather than the damage you take, meaning it can help your party take less damage instead of just you. Saving Rampart when doing your first big pull is important because the 30% cooldown will typically be unavailable for the second pull. Use Rampart in its place here. In other words, when planning your cooldowns for dungeon pulls, you need to plan 2 sets most of the time. Anything with a cooldown over 1 minute will not be reliably available for both pulls. As an example, let me demonstrate how Gunbreaker could plan their cooldowns. For the first pull, use Heart of Corundum, then Nebula, then Heart of Corundum again, then Reprisal, and if the fight goes beyond that, use Camouflage, followed by Heart of Corundum again. For the second pull, you do the exact same thing, except you replace Nebula with Rampart. This, importantly, usually leaves Camouflage, Super Bolide, and Arm's Length as backup options. Remember that Arm's Length makes non-boss enemies swing slower, which is surprisingly potent. Furthermore, if you need more than one cooldown to survive, then sticking to the plan will simply get you killed. Know when you need to go off script and do it. A final thing to add for this tip is that while the tanks have a lot of cooldowns in common, their shortest cooldowns each have a unique twist to them. Gunbreaker's option is the simplest, but does come with an emergency heal attached. Paladin's Holy Sheltron can be stockpiled to hold 2 at a time, which means you can often get away with holding one of them as your backup too. Dark Knight's The Blackest Night is a simple barrier, which means that you get a lot more value out of it if you use it at the same time as your damage reduction. This means that you may need to spread out your defensives a bit more to make them cover what they need to, as you will be missing the short cooldown to extend with that, say, Gunbreaker has. And finally, Warrior's Bloodwedding is so incredibly powerful that on multiple targets it makes you nigh invincible. My only recommendation here is that while you can choose to use no cooldown for a few seconds and then use Bloodwedding, Warrior is not hurting for defensives, and letting your HP drop too hard will cause your healer to panic and use cooldowns they didn't need to. Use Bloodwedding early and often. The fourth tip is about tanking with a co-tank. In non-dungeon content, you will almost always have 1 or 2 other tanks to work together with. This leads to 2 key subjects. Who is the so-called main tank and how do you support them? Typically, who main tanks ultimately comes down to who put the tank stance on. If you see another tank has their tank stance on, it may be beneficial to temporarily turn yours off and let them tank, as multiple tanks fighting for aggro can become a dangerous ordeal for the rest of the raid. Of course, this also means that turning on your tank stance at the start is a way to indicate that you are willing to main tank. Remember, even if the player who ends up tanking the boss is bad at it, you trying to interfere may only make the problem worse if the other tank is unwilling to let you take over. Naturally, should you be the main tank, then you can utilize the tips about positioning and defensive cooldown cycling. However, when tanking bosses, it is often a great idea to keep at least one of your bigger cooldowns ready for a tank buster, boss mechanics that hit the tank particularly hard. However, as an off-tank, what you can do is support the main tank and the raid as a whole. If other targets appear, assist in dealing with these. When the tank buster appears, if it isn't also targeting you, which sometimes happens, you can help the main tank and the team by using your party-wide effects like Reprisal, or by using your short cooldown on the main tank when expecting tank busters. For Dark Knight and Gunbreaker, they can simply use their cooldowns as they are on the main tank. Warriors can use Nascent Flash, and Paladins can use Intervention or even Cover, although that gets a bit more complicated. The time to use Provoke to attempt to take over tanking for the main tank in casual content is when the main tank is in danger of dying. Take over in the last moments. In Savage content, and occasionally in casual content, you instead switch tanks after specific mechanics occur. Usually this is clearly indicated, however. The fifth tip is about the Limit Break. Now, just to be sure, let me explain what it is. The Limit Break is a gauge that becomes available in group content, and it is a shared gauge, meaning that if any one person uses it, the entire party loses it. As such, it is important for the entire party to use it correctly. In a 4-player party, you have access to Limit Break 1 and unlock Limit Break 2 on the final boss of a dungeon. In 8 or more player content, you get access to Limit Break 3. Depending on what role you are, the Limit Break does something different. Melee DPS performs a heavy-hitting single-target attack, while ranged physical performs a line AoE and mages perform a circle AoE. Generally, the AoE options are superior on 2 or more targets. Healers can raise the entire party with their Limit Break 3, making it possible to recover from certain failure. However, the tank Limit Break makes the party take less damage for a bit. Namely, the Limit Break 3 makes the party take 80% less damage for 8 seconds, making it possible to survive mechanics that would otherwise wipe the party entirely. However, the tank Limit Break is in any situation where it isn't explicitly required to survive, completely unnecessary and wasteful. As such, you should only use the tank Limit Break when a boss mechanic explicitly requires it. This happens rarely, for example in A12S or Seed of Sacrifice. In these situations, your team is often straight up handed a Limit Break 3 to use for that. Anyway, the main point of this tip is that the tank Limit Break should only be used when absolutely necessary. Which leads us to the 6th and final tip, which is about breaking your limits. I said earlier that defensive cooldown cycling is crucially important, but sometimes you need to use 2 or even 3 cooldowns to survive. Sometimes, as a paladin, you need to use Clemency to survive. You may even need to do Fast Blade Riot Blade to generate more MP to use Clemency more to survive. As a warrior, Dark Knight or Gunbreaker, you might also need to simply spam your basic combo to get some extra healing if that is what it takes. Sometimes this is necessary, however, naturally, in a savage raid situation. You may not make the enrage timer anyway if you reach this kind of breaking point. But if the boss is close to death, you might still be able to eke out a win this way. Don't give up, and try to push your limits as a tank. On that note, an obscure way to sometimes survive a bit longer is to run around and away from enemies. Did you know that enemies have to turn to face you before they can attack? How about the fact that they will not run up to you before they are ready to attack again? You can use both of these nuggets of information to minimize damage by running around. Just keep in mind that this will be very detrimental to your group's efficiency. But if it is a matter of survival, it's worth it. Whatever it takes to survive, just do it. Ask forgiveness later. And finally, let's talk about when your group decides to pull for you. Sometimes, tank players can get so annoyed by this that they let the player pulling die. It is entirely to your detriment to do this. Let me explain why. If a DPS pulls for you and you let them die for it, then in all likelihood the enemies will either come for the healer next or you. Either way, you are now forced to deal with the same enemies, just now you're one player short. Additionally, while you may have prevented this DPS from doing this again, it is less likely they will cooperate as easily with you later in the dungeon. If instead in the exact same scenario, you decided to intervene and save the DPS, now you're stuck with a group of enemies that maybe you don't think you can handle, but the best you can do is try. If you don't make it, you can ask the DPS to not do that again, and they might just realize that it won't work out anyway. If however you succeed, you managed to do something you didn't think you could. As a result, you learned and became better for it. So, instead of seeing your party pulling for you as them being rude, try to see it as them suggesting that you might be more powerful than you think you are. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel. Fun fact, Dark Knights used to have multiple ways they could spend MP for defensive tools. However, at least by Stormblood, it was considered a DPS loss to use MP on these tools over using ones that did more damage, with few exceptions like Abyssal Drain. For good or bad, this is probably part of the reason why tanks today don't really have to choose between defense or offense.